Talks at Google and the Asian Googler Network are very excited to have Dr. Ronesh Sinha with us today. He's an internal medicine physician, and he's been pioneering corporate wellness programs that help reverse chronic health conditions like diabetes and cholesterol disorders through targeted lifestyle changes. So he's also the author of the South Asian Health Solution and is committed to helping improve people's lives no matter what their background.
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been taking care of Googlers for many years, so it's a pleasure to actually come to Google and talk to you guys. So today we're going to cover a broad array of topics really based on my work and clinical experience in terms of how I really approach my patients of diverse backgrounds. Many of my patients are of Asian background as well, and we're seeing a lot of unique health conditions that I actually wasn't trained to approach in medical training. There are a lot of different nuances to the types of medical conditions we see. So we are definitely going to be covering a lot of content. You're going to have a lot of resource slides. Typically, people know me in Silicon Valley for giving out a lot of information during talks. So often they do have to watch replays of my talks a few times. But the nice thing about the way Lee arranged this talk is we will have about 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. And since I will be I'm an adult physician, so I take care of patients age 18 to 100 plus. But often I do get, because of my topic, I sometimes get questions regarding kids. So I brought my wife, Ronesh Sinha, who's sitting there in the corner. She's a pediatrician. So if there's any questions about growth, micronutrients, or a lot of the issues that we're facing in kids, I'm going to have her back me up on any questions like that, because I may not be equipped to answer all those questions. So with that, we'll get started. And I wanted to sort of start off with a positive, empowering message, because oftentimes, even in medical training, when I was taught about conditions like type 2 diabetes, we were never told that these conditions can actually be reversible. So you're looking at a lab panel of a patient up here, and this is a 52-year-old software engineer who was diagnosed with prediabetes back in 2003. He ended up developing full-blown diabetes in 2014. And if you look up at his labs under 2014, you can see his glucose is 164, his triglycerides are high. And then there's also a number that I've circled called the A1C. And for those of you that may not be familiar with that, that actually tells you what your average sugars are for the last 3 months. So typically when your A1C rises above 6 or 6.5, you've been diagnosed with diabetes. So he ended up developing full-blown diabetes. Incidentally, he'd also seen dietitians and specialists that had said that you're diabetic now, so we need to start you on medication. So I saw him for a consultation, and we went over sort of some of my high principles, and we actually prescribed some lifestyle changes. And literally in less than 3 months, he went from 7.5 to 5.4, so he completely eradicated diabetes in that visit. And this is really the types of things that I'm seeing, and it's been overwhelming to really realize that these conditions that we didn't think were reversible can actually be reversible. And I don't give false hopes to my patients, but what I tell them is we are not a victim of our genes. Many of us have parents, we might have relatives that have diabetes or heart disease, and many of my patients tell me, you know what, I might as well enjoy life because I'm going to become diabetic at 40 anyway, so let me eat these Indian sweets or noodles or rice. But I tell them, no, that's really not the case. Other patients sometimes have false sense of confidence because they tell me, my parents lived to be 80, they were fine, so I can go on doing what I need to do. But unfortunately, they don't realize that some of their lifestyle changes might cause diseases to come on earlier. And so the way I want to express that point is by using a concept called epigenetics. So quite simply, what I tell people is think of your genetic material as sitting inside a smartphone. Okay, that smartphone's inside your body. It's got all your genetic material. And the way we used to think about the genes were we thought genes were hardware. You inherit this gene, and that's what you're programmed to develop, that condition. But the exciting thing about epigenetics, we're finding that it's more like software. So basically, you might have inherited the app for type 2 diabetes or the app for obesity, maybe the app for cancer, Alzheimer's disease. But that app will not get turned on in most cases if you implement the right lifestyle changes. So what types of things turn those apps on or off? Things like emotions, which we'll talk about towards the end of the talk. So stress, depression can turn it on. Food and micronutrient deficiency. So eating the wrong foods or when you're lacking the right types of foods, that can turn the switch on. Inactivity, sleep deprivation, and specific toxin exposures are all elements that we think about. And if we can address those topics the right way, you can become the first person in the family not to become diabetic. So I think that's a very empowering, hopeful concept rather than this sort of genetic, what we call determinism, where your genes determine your outcomes. And really, when we think about how those apps get turned on, this is a very busy slide, but I'm just showing you there are two root cause processes. One is called inflammation. The other is called insulin resistance. And those are the two root cause apps that lead to the development of almost every chronic health condition out there, from cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, all of that. And at a very high level, I just want to go over inflammation basically. At the most obvious level is if I were to trip here on these wires and I sprained my ankle, you would see that my ankle would become inflamed, right? It would become swollen, red, and painful. And that's a protective mechanism to prevent me from actually moving that ankle in a way that would cause further injury. So that's actually adaptive response. But when inflammation is present persistently at a low level, so this is a level where your immune system is active, okay, it's reactive, and it's activated in a chronic fashion, that can lead to more issues like chronic health disorders. So that's inflammation sort of gone haywire. The second process that I put up on that first diagram is insulin resistance. And I want to spend some extra time on insulin resistance because this really is the root cause for most of the chronic health conditions that I'm seeing in my clinic and that we're seeing worldwide. And I actually describe insulin resistance as being a carbohydrate parking problem. And this is an image and diagram that literally in the clinic I show to every single one of my patients and I explain it to them. Because once they understand this process, then the lifestyle changes make a lot of sense. So let's spend a few minutes and go through this. So think of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are basically chains of glucose molecules. Think of those as being a car. Okay, so this is basically the carbs or cars sitting in the center of the slide. And you've got three major parking lots in your body. You've got your muscle, your liver, and your fat. The ideal parking destination, the parking lot for those carbohydrates, is we want that carb to drive to the muscle parking lot. And the way the carbs get inside that muscle parking lot is by using a special parking pass called insulin. Okay? So when diabetics, for example, have diabetes and they require insulin, the insulin is actually the parking pass that gets the glucose out of the bloodstream and into the muscle parking lot. Now the problem is when we become insulin resistant, that muscle parking lot is not responding to the insulin signal. Our body's pouring out more of the parking pass, but the muscle is not responding. So maybe some of the carbs are going to get inside, but now we've got all this overflow glucose traffic, and where is that glucose going to go? So the insulin parking pass can usher the carbs into our fat parking lot. Unfortunately, unlike the muscle parking lot, which has limited space, especially if we're not physically active, the fat parking lot's open 24/7. It's got plenty of space, and that's why people can pile on hundreds and hundreds of pounds of body fat. So that's one direction it can go in. And that visceral fat we'll talk about in a second, some of the side effects, that belly fat. The other parking lot it goes to the liver. And the liver can take those extra carbohydrates and either store them and turn them into fat when they're in excess. So that's why there's a condition called fatty liver, which we're seeing a lot, especially in Asian kids and adults. That liver, when it's overloaded, can also expel those carbohydrates in a form of fat called triglycerides. High triglycerides are a major epidemic worldwide, and it's the most common cholesterol disorder that I see here in Silicon Valley amongst my patients. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's really the root cause. It's basically, I tell people, this is a parking problem, and we need to teach you how to get that glucose car moving back towards muscle. We think of insulin resistance as being linked to diabetes, absolutely root cause for diabetes, heart disease, but now we're finding that that same parking problem is being connected to all types of other chronic health conditions. So one in particular that I'm particularly concerned about is a condition called Alzheimer's disease, which is a neurodegenerative condition that can cause memory loss and other cognitive changes. And the link between insulin resistance and Alzheimer's disease is now so direct, it's so intimate now based on recent research, that now they're calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. And one of the reasons for that is because when you have that parking problem and your body produces extra insulin parking passes, those extra insulin parking passes prevent your brain from getting rid of a chemical called amyloid. And amyloid is actually the substance that accumulates in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. We also see that when people have insulin resistance, a structure in the brain called the hippocampus actually shrinks. And the hippocampus is responsible for learning, memory, and emotional regulation. So this is pretty scary because we're seeing major increases in the incidence of Alzheimer's all over the world. And it looks like diabetes and insulin resistance is one of the primary root causes for that. And that bullet point at the end I'm showing you says that diabetics are 50% more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. It's pretty frightening. And again, I'm not saying that if you have diabetes, you're destined to get Alzheimer's. Again, if you inherited the app or the tendency, then diabetes is a major switch that can flip that app on. Cancer, so again, in my clinic, I deal a lot with diabetes and heart disease, but we're also hearing in our community about first-generation cancers. A woman developing breast cancer, even though there's no family history of breast cancer. We're starting to see that. So again, a case of inheriting an app, but then this condition might be flipping that app on. How this is connected is, number one, when you have insulin resistance, your body can't dispose of glucose properly. That extra glucose, just like humans like to eat sugar, cancer cells like to eat sugar too. So cancer cells, their preferred fuel is sugar. So if you're chronically walking around with elevated sugar and you have a tendency towards cancer, then that could be a trigger. The second thing is, again, I mentioned that when you have insulin resistance, your body produces excess insulin. And that extra insulin actually has secondary effects. So it can increase the release of a substance called IGF-1, and that can accelerate tumor growth as well. So we are seeing that linkage there. And then finally, one other condition I want to highlight is a condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. And if you're a woman or you have daughters, just be aware of this condition, especially if you're of Asian or South Asian background, where we see a lot of this. But basically, this is a condition that's developing in young teenage girls and in young women. And even when I was growing up, I just realized that a lot of our family, friends, their daughters, reflecting back, they probably did have PCOS, but there was no awareness about that condition. And a young woman or a teenager, the types of signs and symptoms they get off at that age are things like irregular periods. They can get acne, they can get facial and body hair, but they can also lose hair at the top of their head, and then obesity as well too. So imagine for a second what a teenage girl or a young woman goes through. Like emotionally, having these types of symptoms during some of the crucial stages of their life can cause tremendous depression and other anxiety. But the downstream impact of that is when you have this condition as a young woman, your future risk of diabetes is 7 times greater. Increased heart disease risk, high risk of infertility, all these things. So I just want you to be aware of this, and this is something to address with your doctor if you start seeing that some of these symptoms are starting to develop in your daughter, or if you're in your young 20s and have noticed some of these things, because this is a condition that's directly linked to insulin resistance. So when you think of the human life cycle, key thing to understand is those two root cause processes, inflammation and insulin resistance, those triggers can occur at any stage of that life cycle. As you're adult, your parents, as you're having that baby, in any of those stages, those conditions can occur. And one thing I want to actually highlight for you too is often I feel like in some cultures, unfortunately, often if a condition develops in the child, often the mom is actually given the blame. It's a very sad, unfortunate thing, but that actually does happen in cultures. If there was a behavioral disorder, if there's diabetes, what happened during the mom's pregnancy. But again, coming back to epigenetics, what I want to make you understand is that now we have lots of studies that show that the male's lifestyle patterns before conception. So if you have a male that's planning to get pregnant and they were sedentary, they're eating a poor diet, they're not sleeping properly, they pass those on to the gene pool through the sperm. Okay, so I tell my couples that are planning to have kids, you treat that event. If you're planning to have children, that's the most important event of your life. Treat it like an Olympic event and you train for it. Optimize sleep, stress, eat the most nutritious foods possible, stay physically active, because otherwise each of you are going to have a potentially damaging effect on the gene pool, not only for offspring, but also for grandchildren. So we see a lot of these behaviors can skip generations. They can actually come from grandparents and go 2 generations down. So really, this is an opportunity to influence that gene pool as positively as we can. So which comes first? So even though I showed them as separate processes, this slide just shows you that insulin resistance and inflammation, they feed on one another. When you've got diabetes or insulin resistance, inflammation levels are higher. The extra glucose in the insulin causes your body to be in a constant state of inflammation. And also, if you have an underlying inflammatory condition, or if you're eating foods that cause more inflammation, that will also put you at risk for insulin resistance. So it is a vicious cycle that feeds where one feeds upon the other. And I also want to make the point about intermittent versus chronic, because sometimes what happens is you might read about some of this work and you're like, insulin's the enemy or inflammation is the enemy. But I want to take a couple of minutes to explain that it's not that those entities are the enemy. It's basically intermittent versus chronic. And what I mean by that is intermittent insulin release is absolutely necessary to control blood sugar. We need insulin to do that. Actually, intermittent insulin release, when you use it the right way, can help with muscle growth too. So if you had a heavy weightlifting workout and then you had a good, healthy carbohydrate that raised your insulin levels, that insulin is going to take the protein and carbs and send it to your muscle, so your muscles can refuel and you can actually grow stronger muscle. So insulin can be your best friend, but in the wrong context, when it's persistently high, it can be your worst enemy. Same with inflammation. I mean, the inflammation system was designed to protect us, to heal us from injury, to prevent infection, but when it's chronic and persistent, that's when the devastation happens. With stress, same things. Emotional stress intermittently can build resilience. It can be adaptive. Physical stress intermittently in the form of exercise is adaptive. On that note of physical stress, I do want to say that in my clinic and going around companies, often I see that people are overworking out. They're doing intensive boot camps every single day, 7 days a week. They're sore every day. And that's actually a chronic stressor that eventually can lead to injuries, or it can actually trigger more of that blood vessel-based inflammation. So many times I'm finding my execs in my clinic that are very type A or other patients, I'm actually telling them to slow down and maybe interrupt boot camps with a little bit more yoga, stretching, or just outdoor walks and hiking. Calories, so intermittent restriction of calories, a practice that's popularly known as intermittent fasting, can be incredibly adaptive. We'll talk about that. But obviously the persistent caloric exposures is really what's leading to a lot of chronic health conditions. So let's talk about how we can each assess our own health risk. Okay, so biometrics, certain lab results can be a guide. The great news I gave you today is genes are more like software, so we can influence and change our genes. And then we're going to focus a little bit more on some key lifestyle changes that have really helped my patients. So one of the key labs I want to talk about first are triglycerides. I mentioned to you that that's probably one of the most common risks that I end up seeing in my patient population. And I'm spending some extra time on this because when I went to medical school and we went through medical training, when we looked at a cholesterol panel, the number that we focused on probably the most at some point was probably total cholesterol and then the LDL cholesterol. But most of what I'm seeing here and also globally, most of the conditions are coming from the triglycerides. So let's understand what triglycerides are. So that red tube that you see at the top of the screen is your blood vessel, and that yellow ball is a fat cell. Okay? So whenever we eat foods, when the food goes from the bloodstream and gets stored as fat, we call that process lipogenesis or fat storage. When our fat cells empty out nutrients like triglycerides, when the fat cells are broken down and that energy goes back towards the bloodstream, we call that lipolysis. So in general, we don't want to be in a constant lipogenic state because we're going to be accumulating more body fat. We want to be able to make sure that on a daily basis we're breaking down body fat as well. So when people have high triglycerides, that tells us that they're in an excess state of lipogenesis. They're storing more fat throughout the day. The other thing, the reason I look at triglycerides as being important is because they are an early marker of insulin resistance, that carbohydrate traffic problem. So if you've had labs done and your blood glucose has always been good, your A1Cs are normal, often patients are like, great, I don't have any signs or risk for diabetes. But if your triglycerides are high, I call that pre-diabetes. That's an early sign already that your body has developed that metabolic traffic problem, so be aware of that. High triglycerides are an early trigger to atherosclerosis, which is the process of plaque formation in the blood vessel walls. And it also leads to the formation of a type of cholesterol called type B LDL. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. High triglycerides also lower your HDL. Think of H as standing for healthy, the good cholesterol. So typically when you look at a cholesterol panel, very common pattern is you'll see high triglycerides combined with low HDL. They go hand in hand because the high triglycerides physiologically push down the HDL levels. Okay, so really be aware of those types of processes. LDL, one quick thing on LDL. Again, I mentioned to you that it was really emphasized in medical training. It's still important, but it's probably not the central culprit in a lot of our patients that have insulin resistance. So think of LDL cholesterol as being a cholesterol boat. Okay, so LDL carries cholesterol. The cargo is cholesterol, and the boat is LDL. So basically, when you get a standard cholesterol panel done, what you're measuring is you're not measuring the number of boats, you're measuring how much cholesterol each of those LDL boats carries. Okay? When you get a more advanced panel, I'm not recommending advanced panels in everyone, but really what's causing a lot of heart disease is two things. Number one, if you're generating more of these small boats, we call those type B LDL particles, and if there's a lot of them. Okay? So you can see in this image from my book, there's a type B, there's a boat that's anchored on to the side of a blood vessel wall. When these boats attach to our blood vessel wall, that's when they trigger plaque formation, which can lead to heart attacks. So generally, when we have more of the small boats, you would think that big boats are worse, but it's actually the small boats that cause more damage. More of the type B LDLs is what causes damage. Now, even without having to get an advanced cholesterol panel, I'm going to give you a quick shortcut for figuring out why, how you might have those type B boats. If your triglycerides are typically above 150, it's almost guaranteed, 80–90% chance that you have the type B boats. If they're above 200, 90–95% chance that you have type B boats. So again, the main point I'm telling you about this in the slide before it is triglycerides often, that is the early marker that instigates all of these changes. It lowers the HDL, makes you develop the small, the type B LDL. So if we can keep track of that number and then make the right lifestyle changes to reduce that, that's really empowering. You can see that you're actually preventing a lot of these health conditions from happening. So let's put some numbers to this, okay? So this is a heart attack case study, not an actual patient. The numbers are actual, but I just put up a name, Ed. So Ed's a 32-year-old VC, venture capitalist, who came to see me after his first heart attack 6 months ago. He has a body mass index of 22, so the general cutoff for the population is 25, but this guy's pretty lean based on his body mass index. He's got normal blood pressure, non-smoker, exercises 5 days a week, and he was told that his lipids are not highly concerning by his last doctor. So now let's go through his numbers, okay? So I put the target levels on the right column and his results basically in the middle. So first thing is his total cholesterol is 190, and I actually put target level as not important, because usually what does it say in most cholesterol panels? What number is the one that triggers concern? When it's above what? 200, right? Whenever people have a cholesterol above 200, then they get concerned. But in this case, his is less than 200, so most people would say, hey, that's not too bad. His LDL, that bad cholesterol, is 108, so typically a cutoff might be less than 100 or less than 130, so that's really not that bad. His HDL came back at 32. That's the healthy, good cholesterol, and in males, we want that to be above 40, so that's kind of low in his case. The triglycerides came back at 250. And the cutoff for most labs is 150, but I'll tell you, based on more recent science, we want that number to be closer than 100. There are actually some healthcare entities out there that use a cutoff of 400 to 500, which is astounding. We got to make sure that it's less than 150. 100 or below is even better, so his was clearly high. And then I put in red the ratios, so this is a key point. When you look at your cholesterol panel, pay attention to ratios rather than absolute numbers. So the first number is the total cholesterol to HDL ratio. You take the 190, divide by the healthy cholesterol, the ratio is 5.9. So it should be less than 4.0, so that ratio is elevated. The other number I want to tell you about is not reported on nearly all cholesterol panels, but I think is one of the most important ratios you can understand, is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. You take the triglycerides, you divide by the HDL, the ratio should be less than 3.0. His ratio came back at 7.8. So if we had looked at these ratios in the right way, if I'd seen this guy 5–10 years ago, I would have been all over him. I'd be like, we have to make sure we fix this as soon as possible. Because his high-stress lifestyle, even though he's exercising, he's young, this sort of cholesterol panel with high stress, probably some family history, I can't recall, probably had some family history. This led to the development of very early onset heart disease, which we're seeing very commonly. Okay, so when we're talking about body fat too, so body fat ends up being a major risk as well too. So I want to spend a few moments to explain to you about body fat. So when you think of body fat, let's use a jelly donut. I know this is not the most nutritionally sound analogy. This might trigger some hunger in people, but I want to use this as an example of body fat and the two major types of body fat. So think of the jelly inside as being a type of fat called visceral fat. Okay? We also refer to that as being like an inflammatory fat, because that's the type of fat, usually around our belly and waistline, that causes chemical substances to be released that can trigger inflammation. Now the crust of that jelly donut, think of that as being subcutaneous body fat, and subcutaneous means under the skin. So most of the visible external fat that we carry around that's hanging over our belt line is subcutaneous fat, whereas the deeper fat that sits inside our liver or encases our internal organs, that's the visceral fat. Okay? So even though the external visible fat might seem like it's more damaging, it's that more invisible fat that causes more trouble. Now I'm putting up this diagram of different ethnic backgrounds because the distribution of jelly to crust varies based on your ethnic background. You look at Caucasians and their distribution of jelly to crust, moderate jelly, and they've got a fair amount of crust around that. African Americans, interestingly, relatively have a smaller amount of that inflammatory jelly, but they've got more of the visible external fat, the subcutaneous fat. And it's interesting, so African Americans do develop diabetes as well too. Their incidence is not as high as most Asians. A lot of their heart disease comes from hypertension. Their rates of high blood pressure are much higher than the other ethnic groups. But then look at the Asians on the right. Okay, Asians on the right, relatively speaking, are carrying around a lot more of the jelly, more of the visceral inflammatory fat, but they've got a very thin rim of the visible fat. And the reason I see so many Asians with heart disease at a normal body mass index is because of that distribution. They've got more of that deep invisible fat, but they've got less of the external fat. So often, many of my heart attack patients have normal body mass index, or they're skinny. They're like pencil thin skinny with very skinny arms and legs, and they're shocked that they develop diabetes or develop their first heart event. It's because they're carrying more of that jelly. Okay, so really important to keep in mind. This is a slide of two famous obesity researchers, Dr. Yajnik and Dr. Yudkin. So Dr. Yudkin is on your left, and he's basically from the UK, and Dr. Yajnik is from South India. And I'm just putting up this slide. They've done a lot of compelling research around insulin resistance, and I'm just putting the slide up to show you. They're actually at an Indian wedding. You can see by the saris in the background there, and they actually have an identical body mass index. But then look at their scans. So what you're looking at on the sides there, those are DEXA scans. So DEXA scans are basically used traditionally to measure bone density, but they're also very accurate imaging studies to look at fat. So the dark purple areas are fat. So you can see that if you compare the skinny guy on the right here, he's got significantly more body fat than the doctor on the left there. And you can see the body fat comes down to be 9% versus 21%. So clearly, he's not carrying around much crust, right? Not much subcutaneous fat, but he's storing a lot of visceral fat. So very, very high risk of heart disease on the right. And this is a cultural thing. You know, in my book, I kind of joke about the fact that a lot of times, you know, if you've got a son or a son-in-law like this, what does a family want to do? They want to overfeed the heck out of that guy because they think that he's going to basically starve to death, right? And a lot of times, skinny guys, a lot of my skinny Asians think that they got the lucky gene. So they go around eating whatever the heck they want, and they don't realize that they're actually causing a bad problem and making it worse because they're actually causing more inflammation by storing more fat in the liver. Often, these slender folks have fatty livers. We check their liver function tests and ultrasound, and their liver is socked away with all the storage fat. And that's why a key message is really don't judge anybody just by looking at them. I have plenty of people with high body mass indexes, and their heart disease risk is quite low because of the lifestyle that they lead. Their numbers are good, but plenty of slender folks that are not leading the right lifestyle, and their risk of heart disease is significantly higher. And it's one other thing I want to mention too about the problem with the guy on the right is not just the visceral fat that he's storing. There's something else that really concerned me. It's the fact that he's so skinny in his arms and legs. When you're that skinny, remember my parking diagram? We want our muscle parking lots to be vigorous and strong. When you've got stronger muscles, they store more carbohydrates. When you've got skinny, skinny arms and legs and you're not working out at all, what that means is it takes less carbohydrates for you to start shifting traffic into the liver to make triglycerides and fat or into that visceral fat store. So it's a combination, more of that fat causing inflammation and less storage space, less energy demand from the muscles. And we have to attack both of those problems if we want to really reverse this risk. So based on this, waistline targets based on ethnicity are actually stratified. Because of that jelly to crust difference between different cultures, this is up here for your reference. So the waistline cutoffs for US, somebody from European background, or somebody from Asian background is different. So unfortunately, somebody from my background, I've got less room for error around my waist, so I've got to stay leaner than somebody that's from a different background. Now, these are general guidelines. I've definitely seen a lot of slender people of European descent that still have a lot of visceral fat and they have fatty liver. But culturally speaking, because of that tendency, you have to look at culturally tailored cutoffs. And this is something I'm educating the medical community about because often you'll see a doctor and you get treated like everyone's from the same ethnic background, right? We're looking at the same body mass index scale, the same waist circumference, but we've got to really culturally stratify that information. Waist to hip ratio is another very powerful way that you can assess risk. So basically, when you look at different cultures, body mass index doesn't tend to work very well. It's a very blunt tool. So body mass index, again, is your weight relative to your height. But waist to hip ratios are a really accurate tool for assessing heart disease risk. So you take your waist circumference, you divide it by your hip circumference, and you get that ratio. And I've got some videos and other references that show you how to do this. Look up a video that says how to measure the waist to hip ratio accurately. But I put the cutoffs there. So this could be a much better way to assess risk because we're really trying to assess that dangerous visceral fat. There's actually a gender disparity, too, in fat distribution. I want to go over this briefly. So coming back to my carbohydrate car and that jelly donut diagram, interestingly, women, especially before menopause, more of their carbohydrates tend to go to the crust, more to that visible fat, okay? For guys, interestingly, their glucose traffic tends to go to the jelly, okay? So what does that mean? So I see a lot of couples in my practice, and often what happens is you'll see the guy, he's like 20, 30 pounds, maybe lighter than the wife, but his triglycerides are through the roof. Inflammation levels are high. And the reason is because his traffic is going towards visceral fat, and his traffic's also going to the liver to produce triglycerides. The woman, the woman's like, my God, I'm like, 20, 30 pounds heavier. All my numbers are normal, but why am I still storing that extra fat? Because more of her fat is going to the subcutaneous layer, less of it's going to the liver. Okay? So before menopause, why does that happen? I mean, when you think evolutionarily, women were designed to protectively store more fat because it's to basically promote progeny. Okay? In times of stress and things, women are supposed to store more fat in that subcutaneous area. So they have more of a protective filter that prevents the cholesterol from going in the wrong direction, the carbs from going in the wrong direction. But unfortunately, when they hit perimenopause and after menopause, things change. So now all of a sudden we've got more traffic going towards that inflammatory fat. In many of my women, when they hit 45 or 50, we start seeing fatty liver triglycerides go up. So I tell women, don't feel bulletproof by this, especially if you have a family history. You've got to prepare for the fact that maybe towards menopause or after menopause, these numbers might start to go in the wrong direction. So we've got to really prevent that by being proactive early on. So this might be a reason why we see this. That subcutaneous fat, it's a separate topic. It's a little bit more difficult to shed. So when we see couples that go on lifestyle plans, typically the male will shed their fat very quickly. But subcutaneous fat, we'll talk about this actually in a couple of future slides. There are other elements to subcutaneous fat that makes it more difficult to shed than just exercising harder and just reducing carbs or calories in the diet. So how do you tell that you have that insulin-resistant carbohydrate traffic problem? So I put a list of criteria. Most of these overlap with a condition called metabolic syndrome. So if you looked up metabolic syndrome, a lot of these are similar. But again, we've gone over most of these principles, so these should make sense. The increased waist circumference or visceral fat, the high triglycerides, the low HDL, the blood glucose, which can be represented by a glucose level or an A1C. High blood pressure also is linked to insulin resistance. If you have certain specific conditions like gout, like fatty liver, like PCOS, acanthosis nigricans is actually a hyperpigmented skin disorder. So a lot of people of South Asian descent, for example, might have these dark streaks in their skin folds. That's actually a sign of insulin resistance. And then diabetes during pregnancy or gestational diabetes are all obviously associated. Now, high-risk ethnic groups, South Asians, East Asians, we're seeing it, Hispanics, Latinos, Filipinos tend to relatively have more of these issues. Native Americans have very high rates of insulin resistance as well. So these ethnic backgrounds do put us at greater risk. So how do we overcome insulin resistance? So at a high level, I'm putting this traffic diagram. This is a bit of a different image from this, and we're going to dig into these in a little bit more detail. But I want to talk about a few concepts based on these different parking lots. So the first thing is when we look at our muscle, we talked about this a little bit, but the first thing is we just have to reduce the carbohydrate traffic. If we're eating excessive amounts of carbohydrates on a daily basis, our muscle parking lot is constantly full. And what people don't realize is if they go through a day and they overeat carbohydrates, I wish when you wake up in the morning, it would just automatically reset and just clear the cache, right? The memory's gone and the muscles open up. It doesn't happen. Your body stays closed the minute you wake up in the morning. So even the healthiest carbohydrates you take in, they have no physical space to get inside. So we do have to regularly make sure we're keeping track of that carbohydrate traffic and keeping it on the lower end. We want to do some form of resistance and strength training. So if you're only doing walking and cardio, those are great for your health. But again, if you're a slender Asian that doesn't have much parking space, we might have to up the weights a little bit and do some squats and focus on large muscle groups so we can enhance the parking space. We want to increase overall activity, getting more walking steps, doing all those things. So that's the muscle end of it. For the liver, same concept. We want to reduce that glucose traffic because your liver actually takes starches, right? So why do I see so much high triglycerides in my vegetarian Indians who don't eat red meat and they hardly eat fat? Because the main fuel for their triglycerides is coming from the starches. It's coming from the flatbreads and the rice, even the lentils in abundance, right? So we have to reduce that carb traffic. We also want to eat clean foods because our liver is our filter that detoxifies. So if you're eating foods that are processed and packaged, if you're eating out a lot and using inflammatory oils, that's going to clog up the liver. If you're drinking alcohol excessively, that's going to prevent us from cleansing the liver. And then practices like intermittent fasting will help empty out some of the extra glucose and fat stores. Now, it's a longer list on the right side. Some of this is similar. Reducing carb traffic, eating cleaner foods, intermittent fasting, powerful. Managing stress and sleep is a huge part. A lot of this subcutaneous fat, believe it or not, is really linked to our emotions. And unless we're able to manage emotions, that subcutaneous fat holds on. Because again, for a woman's body in particular, that feels like a threat. You're in a threatening environment. I'm not going to shed this fat because I'm going to pop out a baby, all right? Even if you're not planning to have a baby, your body's thinking like that all the time. That's like a comforting, insulating type of fat. Replenishing micronutrients. So even if you're on a low-calorie, low-carb diet, if there's specific micronutrients that are missing, then that might promote excessive fat storage. Restoring hormonal balance. So in addition to insulin that we talked about, melatonin because of disrupted sleep patterns, cortisol, which is our stress hormone, if we don't fix those things, we may not shed that fat. And then we do want to limit any environmental toxins we might be exposed to. And then just a quick point, so I'm all about root cause, okay? So now you guys know the metabolic nutritional underpinnings of why insulin resistance happens, but there's a lot of behavioral, psychological underpinnings too. So I often tell people that insulin resistance at its root cause often comes from inner resistance. Many of us are going to walk out of this talk, we're going to understand what we need to do, but we're still not going to do it, right? So what are some of the reasons? I don't have time right now, but you know, things will get easier later in life. We all know that life does not get easier, right? I'll wait till the kids get older. My wife and I have twins, so when they were babies, we're like, gosh, once they hit 8, 10, whatever, things will get easier. Things are not easier, right? You just find a different way to become overwhelmed and busy. Once my startup, I see a lot of execs or I see a lot of people working in companies and they've got business ambitions. Once the startup or this, you know, this idea takes off, then I'll have more time to focus on my health. I'll have money to hire a personal trainer, whatever. We talked about genes, right? Diabetes is in my family. I can't escape it. Why bother? Well, today I've told you, definitely bother because you can be the one to not have diabetes in the family. And then we talked about the other part of the genes where people are like, well, my parents lived a long life. I'm protected. Don't think like that. And then the last one, which is my favorite, I hear all the time, eating lots of rice is part of my culture. I can't avoid it, right? I'm predestined to eat that. And I want to use that last point to transition to my next slide, which basically is if you are going to say that, well, I want to eat rice like my ancestors, then you have to start living life like your ancestors too. You can't be selective about it. So, you know, I'm from a part of India, from Calcutta, so I'm Bengali. So when I was growing up, every summer we'd go out to Calcutta and I'd marvel at the rickshaw pullers there. So we lived in an area that was right near the rickshaw pullers, and I was always watch these guys. And you know, the thing with rickshaw pullers, I actually found this while doing a little bit of research, is on average they run about 40,000 steps a day. And they're doing it in a sprint type fashion. They sprint, stop, sprint, stop. So they're literally doing interval training for several hours each day. They've definitely got strong legs and core because they're carting around families already becoming heavier and heavier because of the obesity crisis or other loads as well. So they've definitely got a strong leg and core. Normal vitamin D levels because you get most of your vitamin D from sun exposure. So if you're dressed like that and you're out in the sun all day, you're not going to have vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D is not just about bone health and strength. The vitamin D actually helps lower inflammation. It can also help with insulin resistance. Okay, that metabolic traffic problem, when you're vitamin D deficient, there are studies that link severe vitamin D deficiency to worsening insulin resistance. So for this sort of guy, eating extra servings of rice is okay, all right? But what about my guy on the right? 2,000 steps is on average what my engineers tend to walk, 2,000 to 3,000 steps. I actually track their steps like a vital sign. So this guy's about 20 times less active than the guy on the left. Weak leg and core from sitting all day. Rampant vitamin D deficiency because we've replaced sunlight with screen light. For him, lots of rice can cause a completely different metabolic disturbance, right? Insulin resistance and all these health crises. Now, I'm not saying we have to quit our jobs and become rickshaw pullers, pulling rickshaws down the 101, but we do want to mimic some of these lifestyle habits however we can. And doing some of this can make dramatic impacts on a lot of the health conditions that we talked about. So, you know, again, coming back to the whole issue of the metabolic traffic problem, this is a little slide image from my book, but these are the types of meals that I see in the patients that come into my clinic. So typically, instead of looking at calories and fat, I will get people to understand how many carbohydrates or net carbohydrates are they consuming each day. And by net carbohydrates, what that means is you take the grams of carb in a food and you subtract the grams of fiber, because that's a healthy part of it, and see how much you're left with. You can use an app, fitness, MyFitnessPal, or some sort of fitness tracker, and just see on a daily basis how much you're consuming. So you can see this is a relatively benign-looking meal, very common. This woman, Samita, is eating, one chapati. She's having a cup of cooked lentils, a cup of cooked aloo sabji is basically a potato-based curry. So that's one meal. And in that one meal, she's basically consuming about 94 grams of net carbohydrates, which is about what I eat in an entire day. Okay, so that's where the problem is. Even though this is low calorie, low fat, she's eating this 2 to 3 times a day. That's going to lead to more of that carbohydrate traffic problem. Okay, what's happening in China? We're seeing a major epidemic of diabetes. The rise there is incredible. I found this one meta-analysis which looked at several studies to assess how much rice is being consumed in China. 625 grams of rice daily, right? And I just told you probably an optimal for our modern lifestyle is between 100 to 150. Right? That's about 4 servings daily. When they compare that to Western populations, they do about 2 to 3 servings of rice per week, right? And this is just rice, right? This is 625 grams just from rice. Add on the noodles, the desserts, whatever sauces and the carbohydrates, we might be close to 1,000, right? So that's really what's really causing a lot of the issues that we're seeing throughout Asia. So based on what I told you, many of my patients, so the thing that was really startling is I found that I was seeing so much heart disease and diabetes risk in my vegetarian Indians, for example, or my vegetarian patients. And I'm definitely a fan of eating more of a plant-based diet, but we have to make sure that we're actually eating plants along with that. Most of my vegetarians are what I call grainitarians, right? So this is a typical plate. This is like a type of meal that my uncle in Calcutta would eat. And I just wanted to show you, you can see we've got 2 flatbreads, we've got a bowl of rice. Those 4 brown golf balls are Indian sweets there. There's all these other carbs here. And the interesting thing is you would eat through this plate, and the tomatoes and cucumbers would always be left behind. So I always tell people that that salad, actually, it's not meant to be eaten. It actually has a decorative purpose. It just adds color to your plate, but eating it is optional, right? So this is a type of vegetarian meals that we're eating. And even in Asian noodle dishes, we might have some vegetables, but there's a lot of starches, and often they're cooked in the wrong types of oils. So those processes of inflammation and insulin resistance are really propagated by eating foods like this on a regular basis and not being active, not creating that muscle demand. Okay? Carb copycats is one concept I talk about in my clinic. How do we eat foods? And now I'm so happy. When I first wrote the book, I put the recipe for cauli rice in there. I was telling people try to lower your starches and add these carb copycats into your food. And now, as you know, most grocery stores, Trader Joe's, have cauliflower rice pre-riced for you. But these simple substitutions significantly bring down our net carb intake. That lowers insulin. It causes your body to burn more fat. So this is just a game-changing tool that can really help lower visceral fat. So simple changes like this are really encouraged in all patients. Now, I get a lot of questions about saturated fat. Is it good or bad, right? I mean, it depends on the week. Every week I feel like the news headlines change. Saturated fat is good for you. No, saturated fat is bad for you. And really, it depends on the individual person. Okay, it depends on your genes. So I put a couple of names of different genes out there. But basically, in my patients, I don't check these genes. But what we do is if we put them on a diet that's lower carb and maybe a little bit more saturated fat, I'll check their cholesterol in 2 or 3 months and see how the numbers look. In most cases, if they're eating healthy sources of saturated fat, I don't see adverse cholesterol elevations. But in some cases, if these genes might be off, there might be significant elevations in cholesterol. And then we have to reassess, are we eating too much ghee or coconut oil or butter in the diet? So my overall approach to fat is you want to diversify. Right now, coconut oil is all over the news, okay? Everyone's putting coconut oil in their hair, in their mouth, whatever they can find, they're putting coconut oil. And I'm not opposed to that, but I tell people you want to diversify your fat intake. Because although in many patients I find coconut oil and butter and ghee will not raise your cholesterol, they have not also been found to be as heart protective as some of the other fats that have been around or have been studied more deeply. So emphasize the evidence-based heart-healthy fats, the monounsaturated fats like olive oil, avocados, nuts, and seeds, omega-3s from marine sources or leafy greens. Eliminate the hydrogenated trans fats. Hopefully we're doing that already. cut back or cut out the seed-based omega-6 oils like safflower, corn, sunflower. Many of us are still cooking with these, but these are highly processed oils that can trigger inflammation, especially if you cook at a high temperature with them. And then if you're using some saturated fat, make sure they're well sourced and use them in moderation, especially if you've seen any elevations in your cholesterol. So if you diversify that fat intake, you should be in good shape rather than focusing on just one type of saturated fat. So overall approach, whether you're vegetarian or non-vegetarian, half that plate's got to be vegetables, okay? A lot of people on low-carb diets use that as an excuse to eat a lot of meat. That's definitely not a healthy approach. Half of it's got to be veggies. We got a corner of protein, a corner of carbohydrates, some of the healthy fats there too. And then I vary this in myself and my patients based on activity. If I did a major endurance event or did some really hardcore workout for an hour, then I can starch up because my muscles need that starch, right? If I had a day where I sat in meetings all day and my muscles don't have much of a demand, I'm going to be much more restrictive about the carbohydrate intake. Same with the protein. If I did heavy lifting and I've broken down some muscle and I need to rebuild some new muscle, I might amp the protein up, okay? But if you're just sitting all day and eating lots and lots of protein, that's not good for your body at all, because excessive protein intake when you're sedentary will cause the release of that chemical we talked about earlier called IGF-1. And that in high amounts on a persistent level can cause more tumor cell proliferation. It can actually increase cancer growth. I put a list because I always get questions about proteins and vegetarians, and I think there was already a question on Dory. I put the list of some of the vegetarian proteins there, and I did a dedicated protein post on that, so for vegetarians. So clearly vegetarians can get multiple healthy protein sources into their diet. Okay, so exercise. I think we're all aware of activity monitors. We want to make sure we're getting regular steps because prolonged sitting does cause an elevation in glucose and triglycerides. So try to interrupt prolonged sitting every 20 to 30 minutes. Use these trackers to keep you motivated. I tell people make sure you've gotten at least 4,000 steps by 12 to 1 p.m. so you're distributing your steps throughout the day. Interval training is a great way to clear parking space. So I'm all about it. If I overate carbs one day, my goal the next day is how do I make parking space? Interval training is a quick, efficient way to do that. So you can use apps like Tabata or Seconds, but basically doing anything high intensity for say 20, 30 seconds, and then pausing for 15 seconds, 20 seconds again. Do a few sets of that. In 10 to 15 minutes, you can clear a lot of parking space in the muscles, okay? So these are great ways that you can trigger fat burning, boost growth hormone. But the one thing I tell you is people that do short session HIIT training, sometimes they use that as an excuse to actually sit longer. They'll do a 10-minute workout, then they go straight back to their computer. No, don't do that. I mean, you definitely want to still incorporate some longer exercise sessions to allow your body to really benefit from that. So don't just substitute an hour workout with a 10-minute HIIT session. And then resistance training. So this is in India during the monsoon seasons. It's hard enough that these guys have to pull humans, but then all of a sudden they have to, pull them through flood water conditions. But, resistance training, like we talked about, is another core part of really reversing insulin resistance. So do full body type workouts, use your legs, do squats, do lunges. I tell my patients when you go to the gym, when your motivation levels are highest, that's when you want to do legs. If you wait till after the aerobic and the other weights to do legs, often people don't do them properly. And really keep in mind that leg power actually does help brain health. So this study was done in identical twins where they actually looked at what was the strongest lifestyle predictor of reduced brain degeneration or loss in memory. And they found that leg power was the actual #1 factor. So believe it or not, leg strength does actually contribute to brain strength as well. These are some apps that I've used in patients to really motivate them to exercise and use their total bodies. So doing things like plank and squats. You can use these apps to actually track it. So sometimes I'll have my patients come back and report back to me how many squats are they doing, what's their plank time. So there's some great tools and devices out there to really encourage full body workouts. And then I tell people create your own rickshaw, right? So one big concept is this rickshaw puller isn't pulling rickshaws. He's not doing it because he's trying to reverse insulin resistance or lower inflammation, right? He's doing it out of his livelihood. And that's the same thing we have to sometimes do. Can you create an active workspace in some way? So I wrote more than half my book on an elliptical machine. I would spend 2 to 3 hours on that elliptical machine just typing away. So I wasn't thinking, oh my gosh, I'm burning fat. I was actually doing work while doing that. Now there are some types of work where I can't be in motion. I've got to be seated and still. But sometimes you're going through your emails, you're going through your iPad messages, whatever. You might be able to do it on your bike or maybe on a walking treadmill. We've got to make activities sort of part of our work life. Otherwise, it's very difficult to sort of stay ahead of these chronic health conditions. And then in terms of burning fat, Keep in mind that just intensifying exercise isn't necessarily the way. What are we eating before we exercise? So fasting workouts work really well in many people. So this particular study looked at some of the genes that would actually turned on when you exercise in a fasted state. So fasted means you still hydrate, maybe have your tea or coffee, but they found on the right side that basically those genes, PDK4, HSL, these genes were actually switched on, so there was more fat burning happening in people that didn't eat anything before breakfast versus people that had their healthy pre-workout breakfast. So keep that in mind. Okay, so I want to show you, now that you're an expert on these numbers, I want to show you my own data. The reason I'm passionate about this is because despite me following a lot of the standard health guidelines, I actually developed prediabetes and metabolic syndrome. So let's take and now that you guys are experts on these numbers, you guys can analyze my numbers. So you can see back in 2009, my triglycerides at that point were 314. My healthy cholesterol was 28, right? Look at my total cholesterol is 154, right? So most people would look at that and go, wow, your cholesterol, total cholesterol is great. But now you know that that really doesn't give us much valuable information. Look at my LDL cholesterol, that was 85. That looks really good based on most of the cutoffs. But the issue here was, look at my ratio. The triglyceride to HDL ratio came in at 11.2. Does anybody remember what the cutoff is? It should be less than, sorry? It's actually less than 3.0 is the cutoff, right? So I was well above that, right? And why was my LDL so normal looking? Because I had those type B. So I knew about this already, so I checked my size pattern. I had type B. When you have small boats carry less cholesterol, and that can make your LDL look lower. So it's really false. It's kind of like a false number because it's really representing smaller particles. As I made dietary changes and I dropped the triglycerides over the years, you can see that my healthy cholesterol went up, right? Because those are intimately related. My LDL actually went up, but in a good way because look, I went from type B to type A. Now I've got the larger boats that don't cause as much damage. They carry more cholesterol. So on a cholesterol panel, the LDL is going to be a little bit higher. But look at my ratios now, right? 1.9, 1.6. So that's really the power of lifestyle changes. You can see one of the critical foods that caused my damage was steel-cut oats and banana in the morning, okay? That comes out to be about 47 grams of net carb. And I know based on my labs that when I go above 100 on a sedentary day, my triglycerides go up. So switching to an omelet, or for my vegetarians, I might do more of a yogurt-based meal with nuts and seeds. We drop that number down. All these numbers get reversed. All without medications, right? That's really our goal. Okay, and then for inflammation, so inflammation, I just wanted to put this up and just show you, just ignore the other numbers, but this CRP is a test marker for inflammation. It's not necessary in all patients, but I want to show that this guy's inflammation levels were quite high. And then with lifestyle changes, he dropped it initially to 3.6. It was still stuck there, but then we dropped it to 0.6. So what was a single change he made that dropped it from 3.6 to 0.6? It was meditation. Okay? So I want to make the point that chronic persistent stress does activate the immune system and cause more inflammation. So this guy, purely through meditation and mindfulness, was able to actually lower that number. So I always remind myself about this example, and really it actually has encouraged me to add more mindfulness practices as well. So please do be aware of that. And based on stress, you know, I kind of call this condition chronic entrepreneur syndrome, where we have a lot of people, I see a lot of execs that are very successful. Their lab normals are completely normal. They're very fit, but their stress levels are high all the time. And it feels normal because they're always hyperactive, they're sleep deprived, and they're coming in with their first heart attack despite having normal labs. And as I've seen more and more of these patients in my clinic, it's motivated me to actually really take that lifestyle balance more seriously. Every single person in this room is an entrepreneur. If you're thinking about doing something greater than yourself, your mind is active, right? I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but if we're not doing mindfulness practices to break up those active situations, then we might be putting our health at risk. For women, we talked about some of the issues in women. So obviously the more common issues are hormonal compromise, infertility, PCOS, resistant weight loss, mental health disorders, a lot of autoimmunity, so Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is a root cause for an underactive thyroid. Postmenopausal, we talked about heart attack risk approaching males. I talk about this a lot, but you know, the key high-level points I want to make for women's health is usually emotional obesity is more common than metabolic obesity. So many women that come to see me, they already have a personal trainer. They're working out 5 days a week. They've tried every diet and cleanse under the sun, but they refuse to manage their stress and improve their sleep. Often they have to do more yoga instead of boot camps and walk more or spend time in nature before they see those stress hormones normalize, and then that subcutaneous stubborn crust fat starts to shed. Okay, so keep that in mind. Often micronutrient deficiencies, so even if you're eating the same foods all the time, you're not adding the right micronutrients, that can promote more of the fat storage. And so again, key point is just adding more exercise and cutting calories back may actually make that problem worse. So self-acceptance is critical for really emotional and physical well-being. So really try to incorporate those if you've tried everything else. So I know we're already at an hour, but I just want to make a quick few other closing points just on how we prevent insulin resistance in our kids, because we are seeing this condition happening in children at a very early age. Okay, this life cycle just shows you how in unhealthy pregnancy, when people are insulin resistant, so in some parts of the Bay Area, in Fremont, I talked to a doctor who said they're seeing Indians that have about a 50% incidence of gestational diabetes. About half of the Indians walk into the clinic have diabetes during pregnancy, which is astounding. And if someone's pregnant, if they're diabetic during pregnancy, then what happens is less carbs and nutrition reaches the baby, and often they can be underweight. And those babies get overfed, and that can actually propagate the cycle of insulin resistance. So this whole cycle is what we want to interrupt as much as we can. The cholesterol problems that we talked about, as a result of this, the triglycerides, the healthy cholesterol, we're seeing kids are developing these issues very commonly. So if you've got a family history of high cholesterol, often the kids need to be screened as well. And then these are really the common things. We're seeing kids that are overworked, they're undernourished, they're overstimulated from digital toxicity, and they're sleep deprived as well too. So my wife and I are now going out to schools and companies to really talk about how we can restore more optimal health in young kids, because they are suffering from a lot of these things. I talk about redefining our child report card. Maybe they're getting straight A's here on the left, but on the right, many of our kids are failing, right? Physical activity, time out in nature, what are they eating, fitness activity, mindfulness, all of these things are core parts of this. And then finally, just keep in mind that those thoughts and emotions, there's a whole field now called behavioral epigenetics. So when we are actually experiencing chronic stress, we can flip on the genes for these chronic health conditions in kids. So we want to make sure we're managing those emotions as well as we possibly can. Okay, so my resources, if you want to reach out to me, you can always reach out to me through my blog. I've got some online programs and ebooks. My publisher agreed to release the children's chapter for my book. So if you actually put your email address in my blog, you will get the whole children's chapter for free. I've also put a book on recharge to help people with chronic fatigue and energy issues. And if anybody ever has questions outside of this session, you can always email me through the blog. I answer every single question that comes to me. So that was a lot of information, but we're done right at 1:04, and we'll have some time to open up for questions. And if there are kid questions, I'll ask my wife to come up here and assist me as well, too. So, great. Yes?
Over here with your recommendations, I've been able to implement this thanks to the food at Google plus what you can get at Whole Foods, Trader Joe's. I go home, I try to implement this with my mother and completely shocked her. We come from a rice-growing family.
Sure.
For breakfast, lunch, and dinner is rice-based.
Yeah.
And cauliflower rice and almond flour-based things just do not exist in the market.
Yeah.
And you don't eat raw vegetables because of the pesticide problem.
Right.
So how do you address in a country like India? What's the thing I was thinking?
It's a very tough crisis right now in India. And in India, the problem is a lot of Western foods have come into the diet as well, too. But all you can do when you go back to India or China or Asian countries is how can you still, even if you can't find cauliflower rice, how can you modify that rice in a different way? So what I tell people is if you just have plain white rice, that's going to cause a glucose and insulin spike. If you were to graph it out, it'd look like this. But you can do a few things to actually lower that curve on the glucose and insulin spike. What do? Anytime you eat vegetables before carbohydrates, you'll lower that reaction by 30 to 40%. So cut up those cucumbers, tomatoes, and have some sort of vegetables before you eat the starch. The second thing is what are you mixing in with the starch? So I tell people, even if you have cauliflower rice, maybe reduce the rice amount by a little bit, mix vegetables into it if your diet allows it, eggs, nuts, and seeds. So Indian-style biryani or Asian-style fried rice is much better because when you add fats, proteins, and vegetables to a starch, you're going to lower that glucose response. And then after that meal, if you inevitably end up eating a meal like that, even a 10 to 15 minute walk after that meal is going to lower that. So it's all about damage control when you go to India, because you're being flooded from all directions with all types of carbs. What are some of the things that you can do to kind of dampen that? And then you're right, we do have more options here. You know, India and Asia are not up to speed on all the different nutritional options that we have. But clearly, we've had people benefit very well in other countries because, you know, it's more eating the traditional foods that our grandparents did and incorporating activity into that. We can already see a lot of benefit from that. So, yeah, we do our best whatever we can. So, but there are a lot of elements of the Indian diet that are very healthy. You know, the spices, the way we cook the vegetables, the proteins and healthy fats are all things. And I think exercise is starting to become a little bit more fashionable in India. So I think doing it the right way, focusing on weight training, these things can help dampen the effects of the high-carb diet.
Thanks for the talk.
Sure, thank you.
My wife has read your book page to page, and she made my life hell. So.
Okay. I apologize, sorry.
A couple of questions and comments. So first thing is, going back to the case study about the ad, the guy was working out. Was it primarily the stress that caused his issues with the heart attack? Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned CRP for inflammation.
Yeah.
Is that a common test that we can recommend?
Right.
As a part of the blood panel? So
Sure.
What is the exact thing we should be
Sure.
asking doctors to?
So let me address CRP, then I'll talk about the guy that had the heart attack. So the C-reactive protein is a very easily measured test that can be done on any blood panel. But my disclaimer is C-reactive protein, so there's one called the HS, highly sensitive C-reactive protein. That's more of a marker for the blood vessel inflammation, so I find that more useful. The general CRP can be elevated if you've got just general inflammation from an infection or if you injured yourself, et cetera. It's very non-specific. A lot of doctors don't like ordering it because sometimes it's elevated and we really don't know why. But that HSC reactive protein, especially in somebody that's got a lot of cholesterol risk factors, et cetera, it can be useful. And the way traditional doctors use it is because if that's elevated and your cholesterol is high, they have a lower threshold for prescribing a statin or a cholesterol medication. In my practice, I have a much lower threshold. Well, I'm much more aggressive about promoting lifestyle changes that lower inflammation, because often when they lower their visceral fat, they manage their stress, that test does come down. So I will tell you that some doctors might be resistant to checking it because if you don't have risk factors, you'll be like, okay, this is a non-specific test. But it is a pretty easily accessible test to do.
Because I had done C-reactive test and my doctor looked at it and she was skeptical about what those numbers mean.
It's not part of the standard approach right now, so I think that's why there's skepticism about it. And the other thing I would tell you is if your test comes back completely normal, that doesn't mean that you don't have inflammation. It's not that. You know, some people can have a completely normal C-reactive protein, but they still have other root causes of inflammation in their body. And unfortunately, we don't have a perfect test, but for example, if people are having a lot of digestive system symptoms like bloating, excessive acidity, that's a sign that their gut health is off. They have inflammation from that root cause. If they have eczema, skin issues. So even without this C-reactive protein, I tell people be a little bit more intuitive about other sources of inflammation in the body. Now, coming back to your question, it's an important one about that heart attack case. That particular case, so I see all combinations of this, but I am seeing quite a few folks that are developing heart disease from over-exercising and chronic stress together, even though those lab results are fairly normal. So one thing is, if you are at high risk for heart disease, what I would say is make sure you see your doctor. In some cases, if you've got enough risk factors, it's recommended to get a stress test or some sort of screening done before you implement intensive exercise. I've had a few tragic cases of heart attacks on treadmills. I had somebody walk outside of a fitness center and drop dead in the parking lot. And in many of these cases, what happens is these guys were carrying around very large, unstable plaques. And now they're in a class where their heart rate's been taken up to 180 or 190. And in that context, the exercise actually pushed them over the edge. So with exercise, I tell people be very gradual in ramping up. And if you've got a family history, enough risk factors, talk to your doctor about whether any baseline assessments need to be done. So, okay? Yeah.
One last comment.
Sure.
Going back to doctors.
Yeah.
I'm surprised. So I became aware of this book, I think, I would say a year or two ago.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see that most of the doctors in the Valley are still not aware of this kind of thing. So,
sure.
So I think part of your education should be also tailored towards other institutions.
Yeah, and it's not just, it's global right now, right? This approach is more the exception than the rule. And I'll tell you one big problem, because I know all my colleagues mean well who are doing this. In today's healthcare system, doctors get 10, 15 minutes to see a patient, right? And I just gave you a very detailed lecture. I do 1-hour consultations, but the traditional medical system is designed for 10 or 15 minutes. It's much easier to prescribe medications. Most doctors have been trained about medications and unnecessary lifestyle changes. That's starting to flip a little bit because now there's fields like functional medicine where people are learning more about this. But the main message here is your doctor is sort of maybe a guide to help you with issues and order the tests, but your lifestyle is in your hands. You know, you're the one that has to find the right content. Sometimes my patients, you know, they've got to assemble a team, a personal trainer, somebody to help them with yoga, maybe seeing a dietitian that's aligned with them, and then the doctors order the lab tests, or they might consult with me or a different practitioner that sort of is aligned with that. But I agree, this is a systemic problem. It's not going to go away anytime soon, so it's sort of up to us to take advantage of the information out there. So, thank you. Yeah, hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I have a 11-year-old who sees the changes we have made in how
Yeah.
we eat and so on, but loves eating.
Yeah.
And told me a few days ago, I wish there was no such thing as overeating. I wish there was no such thing as bad sugar,
Right.
etc. And he's a little bit on the heavier side, does swimming 3 times a week and so on. I'm not sure how to help him. First, we don't have any baseline on his different cholesterol levels and so
Yeah.
on. It's not part of what the doctor checks.
Yeah.
At the same time, it seems pretty harsh to have anything like this
Yeah.
be something you'd propose to an
Sure.
11-year-old.
Yeah.
So I haven't got the update from your
Yeah.
book. Does it help with guiding, you know,
Kids through-
this?
Shell, I'm going to defer to you because
Yeah, I mean, I can talk first about the parameters that
You can
pediatricians
come up there,
use to check lipid panels in kids. So every time you go in for a checkup, you might be noticing that they're plotting your child's weight, height on growth curves, and then you're seeing a third curve called the BMI, which is on percentiles, not a cutoff like in adults. So what's normal depends on the age and gender. So right now, you know, the guideline is that if your child is 85th percentile or higher, and you have family history of, you know, obesity, strokes, hypercholesterolemia, those kids will get a fasting lipid panel done. However, now there's also a general recommendation that regardless of family history and weight, children between 9 to 13 should probably get a baseline lipid panel done. So I think with pediatricians, they know parental anxieties are real, and if you just asked your doctor to please order one, just as a, you know, as a baseline, so you know what you're working with, how seriously you need to take your child's weight. And maybe your child's weight is normal, and he just looks a little over to you. But that's why it's important to plot the curves first to see where you are. And then I think that what you said first is that in your household, you yourself have implemented those changes already, and that's the biggest single thing you can do to influence your child's habits. So I always tell parents that you can't have a double standard where you're doing one thing and you're lecturing your child to do this. So I think just by example. Now I know it's tough with kids because, you know, they'll go to school, their peers are bringing like really unhealthy lunches, they're going to birthday parties, they're getting fed lots of unhealthy treats. But I feel that on a day-to-day basis, what they're getting at home, that's actually building the foundation. So I think that's the single most thing I would do for my own child.
And we're not recommending, like I know I talked about grams of carbs, but maybe we're not recommending that for kids that are
because
growing.
they're still growing.
They're
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so with kids, like, it's more like the pictorial plate. You might have seen that. So just teaching your child, like Ron had a slide up there, to fill most of it with a source of vegetables. So starting with the salad or vegetable soup, and then 1/4 of it the carb, and then 1/4 of it the protein. And if they want to take seconds, then it should be in that same ratio. So not just taking seconds of the carbs once they're done with the plate.
And you're really training their taste buds too for later, because many of the kids are averse to eating any vegetables. So you often say to just even give them 1 piece or 2 pieces of broccoli or
I get
something.
a lot of
so.
concerns from parents that, oh, my child will just not touch a vegetable. You know, so I tell parents to just start with like 1 broccoli stalk or 1 baby carrot, and then just go up from there. So every day just add that to the plate, and it's an acquired taste. And then also growing vegetables. I think you had mentioned, you know, concern about pesticides. So I don't know if your relatives in India could grow their own vegetables in the backyard. And with kids, actually, that motivates them to try to eat the vegetables as well. So it's like a win-win.
Yes.
Question about high blood pressure. You didn't talk today, but
Yeah.
I see a lot of my South Asian friends and family,
Yeah.
even in 20s, the high blood pressure is
Yeah.
very much common. So my question is how much, are South Asians genetically prone to high blood pressure?
Right.
And second question is, can lifestyle reverse? Somebody who is on medication for decades, can lifestyle
Sure.
change helps them to go off and get the numbers back?
Good question. Yeah, so blood pressure, I kind of put it on the list, but I didn't focus on as directly. What I would say is blood pressure does have a stronger tie to genetics than the other issues that we talked about. But with blood pressure, first of all, it is tied to insulin resistance because when your body has excess insulin, your blood vessels retain more fluid and they become stiffer. So often when we reverse insulin resistance, blood pressure can drop down. The other issue with blood pressure, though, is a lot of it has to do with stress and sleep as well, too. So if stress and sleep aren't managed, then often blood pressure will stay high. And unfortunately, we live in high-stress Silicon Valley. Many people, unless they incorporate those mindfulness, slower practices, it will not get better. And then nutrient-wise, too, paying attention to the sodium-potassium balance. So as we lower the amount of processed foods which have more sodium, and we eat more plant-based foods, lower sodium and higher potassium naturally will lower blood pressure. So there are definitely some ways you can address that. But even having said that, I have some elite athletes in my practice, and they're on blood pressure medication because both parents had it. They just genetically have stiffer blood vessels. So I think there is a potential for normalization, but in some cases the genes can play a strong role there. But definitely the sleep and stress are major factors there. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
So I have a few things in common with what you said in terms of being brought up in Kolkata.
Yeah.
And also having twin boys.
All right.
My question is, this whole approach to medicine seems to be very cognitive and mechanistic in the sense, I use the word mechanics just to, point out that it's numbers based, and it's almost like you have to have this app watching you and advising you through every moment of your life, versus a very intuitive way of choosing your diet, right? Your body speaking to yourself, your mind.
Yeah.
And that's how I saw my grandparents picking what
Sure.
they want to eat, right?
Yeah.
So is that even feasible in this day and age to allow your body to speak to you and point you to the right choices versus doing it in a very numbers-driven, cognitive way?
Great point. Most of my talks have a slide of I literally have a slide of my grandmother, and then me with all these wearables attached to it. And I make the point that our grandparents had this sense of intuition. What I would say is the goal is to get to that point you were talking about. Right now, the signal-to-noise ratio is crazy because of our stress and sleep deprivation, how much sugar and stuff we're eating. So people don't even know what it feels like to be healthy. So often I drive them with the metrics, so then they have something to hang on to, and that empowers them. But as you can see, I haven't worn a Fitbit now for probably 3 months because I intuitively know when I'm being sedentary and when I'm, being more active. But at some point, you listen to your body's signals and you don't become programmatic. And I got to say that Shelly can attest to this. I can be very protocol-driven with my workouts, and she's like, you just need to chill out and relax today. So she knows better than me sometimes that there are days where I've got to sort of do something that's more intuitive and based on my feelings and not based on my schedule of I've got to do boot camp every Monday, Tuesday. But I think it's absolutely possible. And when I see patients for follow-up at a certain point, I'm like, just listen to your body at this point. You've got some rough markers. How's your waistline doing? How's your weight? Et cetera. But I think the goal is to get back to that intuition. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks for that. Yeah. So I'll go online to this question. How do I find a primary care physician who's aware of the more stringent cutoffs for measuring health of South Asians and or work with one who isn't? So, luckily these cutoffs now have a lot of data behind it, like the World Health Organization and other entities have set these cutoffs. So many doctors just don't know about this, but this isn't off the cuff. So I think you can still educate your doctor. Many of our patients have gone and educated their doctors. Within our group, we're pretty well versed in this, but if your doctor is not aware of that, the main thing you want with the doctor is you want a doctor to be open-minded. So even if they're knowledgeable, if they're willing to learn and use some of these cutoffs and things, then I think that's perfectly fine to do. Next question, can you talk a bit about why vegans and vegetarians have much lower rates of diabetes in population studies? Got a link there. A recent randomized study showed a low-fat vegan diet with no calorie restriction was more effective at reversing type 2 diabetes than a control diet with calorie control. Great question. So the main thing I'm going to say is, again, it depends on what sort of vegetarian or vegan diet's being consumed. So I know I said a lot of negative things about a vegetarian diet, but I'm talking about the typical Asian or Indian-based vegetarian diet. If somebody is eating the really plant-based type vegetarian, so if you look at a typical Western vegan or vegetarian diet, usually that's much more plant-based. Western vegetarians tend to do more physical activity, exercise, and the other entities. So when you look at those studies, you're definitely going to see a lower rate of diabetes. So I'm definitely not anti-vegan or vegetarian, but people just have to analyze, are they eating the healthy version of that? The other thing is when people are eating a lot of the extra carbs in the typical Asian diet, they're missing out on micronutrients. And those micronutrient deficiencies like vitamin D and magnesium, et cetera, those can also raise the risk of disease. But there's a lot of studies out there. And I tell people, general point, you are your own study. You know, you can find studies that are pro-vegan vegetarian, anti-vegan vegetarian, but know the basics, make the changes, and then follow your numbers before, midterm, and after to see what the response is with you, and then go from there.
I know you talked about micronutrients. Can you elaborate a little more about what is the spectrum of micronutrients we should focus on?
Right. So what I would say, and you can fill in some for maybe kids as well too, but for adults, so vitamin D I've been talking about a lot, right? So vitamin D is a critical one. So definitely that's something we want to assess, especially if we have an indoor lifestyle. Us that have, you know, skin tones that are darker, we tend to be more vitamin D deficient because we're not getting as much of the UVB rays. Iron deficiency is something that I guess you'd see more in kids, but in adults, depending on the risk factors, that can be a factor, especially with the vegetarian diet.
Also.
Women in particular too, obviously. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Right. So that's the other micronutrient. Now, magnesium is tricky. You know, magnesium is linked to a lot of the conditions that we talked about, but a standard blood magnesium test won't give you that data. I tell people that if we're having these, most of us are magnesium depleted just because of our soil. So I think making sure you're eating magnesium-rich foods is key. For vegetarians and vegans, and even some of our non-vegetarians, we do see B vitamin deficiencies too, so B12 and folate. So it is worthwhile to check for those and making sure you get adequate sources of that. So those are some at the high level, some of the major micronutrients. Am I missing some?
Yeah,
Maybe in
I
kids?
think just to take a step back, so when we say micronutrients, we're referring to vitamins and minerals, and these are like crucial in all the enzymatic processes in your body. So macronutrients are just proteins, carbs, and fats. So then to fill in on how those are metabolized, that's where your vitamins and minerals come into play. So aside from the examples Ron gave, particularly in kids, I would definitely emphasize calcium and zinc as well, and iron for sure. And you know, for example, with iron, they've even shown that iron deficient kids can perform poorly on math and language tests. So it even affects their brain development if they're low in any of these micronutrients. So very key. And then just in general with even adults, if you're low in micronutrients like iodine and selenium, it can affect your thyroid function. And it may not show up on your thyroid hormone tests, but you may be experiencing symptoms of low thyroid function. So these are where those micronutrients really play a big role. Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up
Sure.
question,
Yep.
especially for the kids.
Yeah.
If we feel like through the diet they're not getting a full
Yeah.
spectrum of these, do you suggest just giving them over-the-counter
Vitamin.
vitamin?
Yeah, I
vitamin
get that
supplements?
question a lot. The problem is that they're just not absorbed as well from a multivitamin. And a lot of times it's because it's complementary. So like, for example, taking iron with something high in vitamin C, you'll absorb a lot more of it than if you take it with something that's really high in calcium. So it's like synergistic. And also the vitamins are just maybe not going to provide all that the child needs because they do have growing bodies, right? So I definitely, and I think just setting the good habits early on eating a well-rounded diet, not just kind of teaching them to take a pill, that just will go, yeah.
Yeah, and one other point too with the vitamin absorption, so the fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K, those are fat-soluble vitamins. So when you're eating vegetables with some healthy fat in it, it does increase the absorption of that. So that's the whole point about making sure we've got the proper nutrients around that. So.
Can I just piggyback on that question?
Sure.
Sorry. So how about probiotics to improve the brain-gut connection and all of that?
Sure.
Is that for kids especially?
For kids, yeah. So basically for adults and kids, we're all fans of gut healthy diets. And, you know, we try to introduce it through foods as much as we can. But some people, at least in the adults, you know, they might need probiotics for optimal, you know, gap sort of coverage of those needs that they have. We always say that probiotics are sort of a temporary placeholder strategy. While you're sort of eating more gut-friendly foods, probiotics can help. But some people do find that long-term wise, they're thriving on the probiotics, and there's no reason why they can't continue that.
I think in kids, I don't normally put them on probiotics unless they just got like an antibiotic course for like an ear infection or something. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, I normally recommend lots of yogurt daily in the diet. And then in the Indian diet, like any of the pickles, that's also loaded with probiotics. So just getting it naturally from the diet.
Like for attention deficit or things of that nature that are behavioral, do you see a difference in choosing that kind of diet and a correction in the symptoms?
Definitely. With my ADHD patients, even lowering the sugar content in their daily diet sometimes makes a huge difference. I've had parents of autistic kids take out all the preservatives in their diet. That's made improvements. So I think the diet connection with kids' brain development is so key. So definitely what they eat is definitely manifests in the way they behave, in the way their cognitive functions occur. Yeah.
I'll go online for this one. Can you talk a little bit about good carbs versus bad carbs? We know from dozens of interventional studies that whole grains and legumes are associated with lower risk of chronic disease. But these are carbs. Many people are afraid nowadays of all carbs. Okay, so this is a really important point because I did put carbs at the center of this, but there clearly are healthy carbohydrates out there like lentils and beans that are part of our staple diet. But what I was talking about is especially if you have an insulin-resistant condition and that parking lot is closed or you're not active, these even healthy carbs in abundance are causing issues. Most of the patients that I see in my clinic are not drinking Coke or eating pizzas. They're having grains, they're having quinoa, they're having lentils, and we're still seeing a lot of these conditions happen. The good news is once they implement the right lifestyle strategies or physically active, then absolutely you can reintroduce some whole grains and lentils and see how people do. It all comes down to that individual experimentation, but I don't want people to be afraid. And these, quite frankly, legumes are very gut-friendly foods. I mean, our gut loves that sort of prebiotic fiber that sort of reaches the healthy gut bacteria. So I don't want people to become phobic about this, but just be aware that quantity can't make a difference. And if you have a condition like insulin resistance, we've really got to be careful about the amounts. So for this protein source, just simple answer, just I put a couple options on that list, and then I would refer people to my blog on the protein on the protein link. Yeah, so if your diet allows dairy, for example, so even things, good quality paneer is fine. Obviously, yogurts for the probiotic source are okay. Some quantities of cheese is okay. Quinoa is fine, too. I mean, quinoa I know can be high on the carb side, but it's a great source of protein. Nuts, seeds, nut and seed butters obviously are good sources. If vegetarian diet allows some egg consumption, then we're big fans of having eggs in there as well, too. So at a high level, those are some. And like I said, lentils are a good protein source. And yeah, and then organic soy, you know, if there's no issues with soy, then doing non-GMO soy sources can be another option as well. So,
what I mentioned that I sometimes take whey or other like supplements after workout.
Yeah.
Because they are like, they add calories, but they are protein intense.
Yeah, for a lot of my slender folks that are trying to add more muscle mass, I'm a fan. You know, we do with our kids, and I'll do after some workouts, I'll do a good quality whey protein shake. And there's some good data behind whey protein supplements in terms of lowering cholesterol, diabetes, heart disease risk. So just make sure it's a good quality. What I mean by that is a lot of whey protein shakes have artificial sweeteners and other ingredients, but definitely, especially for vegetarians where it's tough to get enough protein into the diet to build muscle, I think the whey protein supplements are fine.
That's on even on non-workout days, right, to make up for protein content?
You can do that, yeah, but again, the whole protein is more bioavailable, so as long as you're not using it as a meal replacement because you want to get the other nutrients around that protein. But I think, yes, sometimes my vegetarians might do a whey protein shake when they're on the run or as a mid-afternoon snack. I'd rather have them do it through that way than getting unhealthier sources of protein, so yeah.
I wouldn't do too many protein shakes for kids. It puts a lot of load on their kidneys.
Is eating Indian ghee or egg yolk 3 to 4 a day? Okay, a lot of mixed opinions on this. This all comes back to the point about personalization. There's a study that I quote, to give you an idea, there was a New England Journal of Medicine study done on a gentleman in a nursing home who was eating 18 to 20 egg yolks every single day for like 8 to 9 years. And he had a perfect cholesterol, like it could not even be better. So he has a genetic capacity to actually metabolize that. But some people that have those genetic markers that I talked about they may not do well with that. Their cholesterol might actually go up. So again, I think you want to start probably not as aggressively as 3 to 4 a day. You can up it a little bit and then recheck your cholesterol to see if you might be fat sensitive. But again, the egg yolk should be in the context of eating other vegetables and other foods. We don't want to become just, focused on excessive amounts of fat in the diet. Eating Indian ghee in most of our patients is fine. It can actually lower inflammation if they're not saturated fat sensitive. In healthy amounts, we find that it is good for health. Does duration between meals, timing of meals, and combination of certain meals matter? I hear a lot of Asian tips to eat certain foods only a certain time of day or not to eat some foods together. What's the truth? How does it relate to intermittent fasting? Great questions. So one reference is I've done a couple of blog posts on fasting. I think it does make a big difference. And for a lot, and again, I'm giving general guidelines, but the overall approach to eating every 2 to 3 hours to speed up your metabolism, I think that can really be a negative pattern for a lot of people. Because again, if you've got insulin resistance and you're eating every 2 to 3 hours, you're spiking insulin constantly. So for many of those folks, having more gaps between nutrient-dense meals is a better approach. They're actually going to burn more body fat by doing intermittent fasting. So we have to think about the context. For other patients, for example, women who might have adrenal issues, nutrient deficiencies, they might have to eat more often. So they might have to eat more frequently to get the nutrients into their system. But meal timing is a real critical thing. A lot of us are very structured in our approach to how we eat our meals, but sometimes longer spaces to recover from high carbohydrate meals, maybe the night before, is a good way to do it. So don't be programmatic that every day I'm going to eat every 2 to 3 hours. Our lives are very flexible. Some days you binge eat the night before, then we have to correct the next day by maybe doing some intermittent fasting to allow our liver to recover. So that's a very high-level point on that. There's more nuance to it, and like I said, refer to the blog and book for more information on that. Great. So thank you to people online in the room for joining. Hope that was helpful. Thank you. Thanks, guys.